At this event, I'm delighted to say we've brought together the authors to elaborate on some of the points within this report. So perhaps I can start on my far right, at least logistically, if not politically, I should say. We have Dr. Alexander Gionis, who is a research fellow in chemical and biological security at the Harvard Sussex program. That's with the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. Dr. Gionis recently completed a PhD on continuity and change in the OPCW and has worked within the technical secretariat in the past. On my left, I'm joined by my UNIDIR colleague, Ms. Maria Garzon-Maceda, who is an associate researcher with the WMD program at UNIDIR. Prior to joining us, she was a policy fellow at the European University Institute and spent a decade in the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on a range of issues, including the implementation of the CWC. And last but not least, I'm joined by Dr. Alexander Keller, who is the CBWNet project leader and network coordinator, as well as a senior researcher at the Berlin office of the Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Alexander was formerly a senior policy advisor with the OPCW between February 2013 and December 2019, and has worked prior to that as a lecturer and researcher at the universities of Bradford, Bath, and Belfast. Before opening the panel and turning to our authors, I'd like to take the opportunity and the great privilege to be able to invite Ms. Nicola Stewart, the UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the OPCW, to provide some opening remarks. Please, Madam, you have the floor and hopefully the screen should both be yours.
Let's see if the technology works. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm Nicola Stewart. I'm the UK's Deputy Permanent Representative in the delegation to the OPCW. And I'm here on behalf of the UK to just underscore how pleased we were to have been able to support the work of these great researchers in terms of preparing this report. James has helpfully laid out the rationale for producing the report and the important opportunity that the review conference offers for all states to look back at our collective achievements and help then set the future direction of the organisation. As many of you will be very aware, the backdrop to the last review conference in 2018 was a number of instances of chemical weapons use, including in the UK. There will be challenging issues this year as well, but we remain committed, as I know to so many of you, to working constructively towards the May conference. It is really important that we make the most of that process to discuss our respective priorities and come together to reaffirm again our commitment to upholding the convention. Many of us in the room today are involved now in the open-ended working group preparations, and we're really excited about those discussions which are ongoing. This UNIDIR report, which I hope you've got copies of, brings together some of the really key themes 26 years after the entry into force of the convention. Firstly, it reflects on the challenges and possible scenarios ahead for us at the review conference, and the report helpfully considers some of the consequences of those scenarios. Secondly, it focuses our attention on reaching the significant milestone, the destruction of all declared chemical weapon stockpiles. In this context, we should reflect on how best to implement the verification regime going forwards and ensure that the Secretariat retains its expertise on chemical weapons and their destruction. And thirdly, the report acknowledges the continued threat of chemical weapons use by both hostile state and non-state actors, and the need to ensure that the OPCW remains ready to respond. Underpinning all of this is the need to understand scientific and technological advances of relevance to the convention and help all states fully implement the provisions of the treaty. I'd like to thank the UNIDIR team and the report's authors for all of their efforts to help promote dialogue on disarmament and security. And we hope that this report helps inform discussions during the review conference and ahead of the process. And I'm looking forward to the questions that might be put to the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for the kind words. And taking the point on making the most of the process, I suggest that we now proceed to the panel discussion. The format for today will take the form of some short questions from myself to begin the discussion, then we'll turn it over to you. So invite you and encourage you to please share your questions, comments, thoughts that you may have for the panel or each other. For those of you in the room, if you could raise your hand and let me know if you want to take the floor. For those of you online, please do use the Q&A function. We'll try and get to as many questions as possible, but please don't be upset if I can't get to all of these, but we will try. Okay, with that in mind, perhaps we can move. Oh, one thing I should add as well, all panelists here will be speaking in their personal capacity, so the views are not necessarily reflective of UNIDIR or the UN wider system. I just want to make that quite clear. With that in mind, perhaps I can start with a question for you, Alex, and perhaps you could provide a little bit of sort of setting the scene and providing the context in which the review conference will take place. The floor on the screen, yours, please.
Thank you, Jamie, and well, thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, when I'm thinking about context, I suppose I've sort of got 5 different contexts in mind. I won't give too much detail on all of those, but it's, I think, important to think about, and if anyone else wants to chime in afterwards. But obviously the big context, of course, everyone recognizes this in the room, is this geostrategic one, dominated by the fallout from the war in Ukraine. I think this meta sort of political environment will condition to varying degrees what happens and what can happen within the review conference itself. I don't want to make too many predictions, but we have seen in sort of previous disarmament and arms control fora over the past 6 months and a year, different things playing out. So we need to be aware of the sort of tensions there. Zooming in a bit to the organization, I think sort of organizational contexts will be very important to consider. So of course, as mentioned, the end of routine verification of destruction of chemical weapons. So there's a short-term concern, a contextual concern about, you know, what next? That feeds into a longer term question of functional rebalancing for the organization. So how do they actually maintain expertise next door? How do they keep that kind of, how do they keep, I suppose, inspectors, that knowledge, with a view to the longer term of assuming and I guess knowing that perhaps states in the future may come into the regime, we will need to sort of undertake destruction activities. There is 3 others, which I'll just touch very briefly on, but science and technology is a context, of course, which is unfolding the whole time here. And I think we need to be thinking it internally for the organization as well. So what sort of science, what sort of technologies are being used, for instance, in verification? How are we understanding these changes? And of course, externally, what sort of environment is the CW operating in terms of technologies in the chemical industries? As Nicola pointed out, of course, there's a very important normative and political context here. So I suppose to sum that up, it's states parties thinking, you know, what are our priorities moving forward, especially in light of reports from the IIT. And I think just a slightly more abstract one, but I think it is important here, is because the context we think about is here and now, but the Chemical Weapons Convention is of infinite length. And so we also need to be thinking about what sort of contributions we want to be making at this review conference in the sort of longer unfolding history of this regime. And I think that that's an area that we can all try to make a difference in. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. I'd also add, perhaps on a slightly more optimistic note, I think despite a difficult year in arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation last year, we did have a glimmer of hope with the successful consensus outcome from the BWC Review Conference. So perhaps a glimmer of optimism there. Building on what Alex said, perhaps I could turn to you now, Alexander, to talk about some of the issues that are likely to be faced at the review conference. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm more than happy to do so. And also from me, a very warm welcome to everybody in the room. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day. And I'm afraid I will already start repeating some of the points you have heard the previous 2 speakers make, because when we think about what the salient issues will be, obviously the context is quite relevant in informing those salient issues. So let me start with the elephant in the room, and that is the CWUs in Syria and elsewhere. And here, quite obviously, the question of identification of perpetrators is the dominant one. And you all are aware of the work of the IIT, which has recently released its 3rd report, in which it concluded that Syrian armed forces had used CW in Douma. And looking towards the review conference and then further out, I think the really important question to address, where the review conference, in my personal view, as Jamie Rebel mentioned earlier, where the review conference should put down a marker is to point towards a way of mainstreaming the identification work currently undertaken by the IIT into the more routine kind of operations of the Secretariat. Perhaps that is done fairly easily. Perhaps it requires some state party involvement in the sense that decisions need to be taken by the policy-making organs. That I think would lead a bit too far. But I think the foundation for such mainstreaming to take place is already contained in the conference decision of June 2018, which was entitled Addressing the Threat from CWUs, in the paragraphs 19 and 20 of that decision. So I think one important issue to address for states parties at the review conference will be this question of how to preserve the progress that has been made with respect to the identification of perpetrators of CWUs. And that feeds into the larger question, that's my second point, about how to develop the verification regime of the convention. Again, it has already been mentioned briefly that the Secretariat needs to retain CW-related knowledge and expertise for reasons of abandoned chemical weapons, possibly resurfacing in the future, the ongoing old chemical weapons issues that you all are aware of, and because of the 4 holdouts, one or more of which may join as a possessor state at some point in the future. So that is the chemical weapons related side of the routine verification business of the organization, which will be scaled down, it is my understanding, from September onward. But there is obviously also the industry verification side of routine inspection activities, and that will remain important. And from what I gather, will have to be updated and adapted in light of changes in the chemical industry, its geographical distribution around the globe, and also scientific and technological advances. And here again, the practice has been that sort of modifications to some selection algorithm could do the job in the past. I'm not so sure whether that will be possible in the future as well, or whether some more substantive discussion and decision-making on the part of states parties would be required. And again, that is something I would imagine to feature. And last, but certainly not least, let me also mention the area of international cooperation and assistance, which is obviously an important one and will continue to be important for the implementation of the convention. I think there is a bit of light and also a bit of shadow here that one has to acknowledge. The shadow perhaps been that in terms of national implementation, the numbers that one can hear people talk about, such as the DG mentioning some numbers recently in a statement, do not sound too different from the numbers that were contained 5 years ago in the chairperson's report from the last review conference. So it seems there is a number hovering around 65 to 70 states parties, which still are quite a bit behind in their national implementation measures. And the question really is how to tackle that number of states parties and how to get that number down perhaps a bit more significantly in the next 5-year period. And then there is, and with that I'll close, the issue of assistance and protection, including against the threat of use or use of chemical weapons by non-state actors such as terrorists. And again, quite a lot of activity has taken place acknowledging this and building on these many activities that were conducted in the field of chemical safety and security in particular, I think will and should justifiably be an issue for the review conference to look at in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I actually wonder if our producer, if you could add in a link to the IIT report, it might be useful for colleagues here. And also, again, to provide a bit of optimism to the shadow that you referred to, Alexander, perhaps we could also put in the report to the SAB report, which does a link to the SAB report, which touches upon some potential technological opportunities for verification, which I thought was quite interesting as well. But thank you very much, Alexander. Now, if I can turn to you, Maria. And really, it'd be good if you could talk through some of the recommendations from the report and get your thoughts or any follow-up you may have in response to Alexander or Alex. The floor is screen yours.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming again, and thanks as well to Alex and Alexander for the previous points. Since, of course, the 10 recommendations we make in this report are linked to all of the issues they have mentioned. Addressing the points that we consider relevant, but it's, of course, these are not exhaustive recommendations. Some of them refer to the process of preparations, so how to arrive in good shape. And then others refer to specific topics that we think might be relevant or will be relevant in the discussions. I'm not going to go into detail, but hopefully this overview will also help in tying together what was just discussed here and your questions and discussion afterwards as well. So the first thing, the first recommendation, let's say, is linked to the issue that this review conference will only have 5 working days, which is a reduction if we compare it to previous review conferences. So the time scale is challenging. So preparations, and this might be obvious, but should start as early as possible. This year, the disarmament calendar, the meetings calendar is looking a little bit better, let's say. So hopefully that helps. But as you all are aware, states' internal preparations for any review conference take time. So internal consultations with all of the stakeholders and agencies within each country take time. Another aspect of preparations, of course, are office holders and the technical secretariat, who we suggest should have contingency planning in place. This is mapping the procedural issues that might come up, but also the substantial issues that might come up. What are the linkages of issues that might come up, and also the coming up with different scenarios and different options that they can put on the table, from option A, B, C till Z. So all of that has to be done with sufficient time. Another aspect of the preparations is all of the meetings, talks and discussions that are held before the review conferences in the context of the OPCW, but also outside. So, for example, we have Wilson Park meetings, and one option that we think might be helpful is perhaps following examples that we have seen in other treaties. Doing an ambassadorial retreat prior to the review conference, for example, might be helpful. And in all of these processes, all of these meetings, all of these discussions, one important aspect we highlight is to have all voices heard and represented. So having a really open participatory process, it's really important. So sort of avoiding, because of course, informal consultations are part of any of these processes, but kind of avoided that in-group, out-group dynamic that can sometimes happen. Another aspect that we want to highlight in terms of the next intersessional program is that, as we have seen after COVID, new modalities of work are part of our lives now. So hybrid meetings, doing more of those, they have been part of the OEWG and also the SAB, but taking that forward could help in getting more voices from all around the world participating in these processes. As I said, the other sort of recommendations or suggestions in this report are linked to the particular issues that are going to be discussed. We mentioned a few in the recommendations, so further engagement with civil society and industry, of course, This is not new, but proper effective implementation cannot be done without them. Then on the issue of international cooperation and assistance, also a key aspect that was mentioned, and the future of the verification system, as was also mentioned. We also touch upon some governance issues. So the tenure policy, for example, establishing a process perhaps to potentially amend it. The new issue of the Chemtech Center will also need to be discussed and guidance needs to be provided. And then the cross-cutting issue of gender equality. And this is kind of twofold. On one side, promoting equality in discussions, both in policy discussions and in technical discussions. And also during the conference itself, supporting those initiatives that combat gender stereotypes, supporting those initiatives that promote diversity, and also developing assistance programs that have gender perspectives embedded within them. Sorry. So kind of to close up these recommendations, I do want to highlight that our report is named Preparing for Success at the Review Conference. So we might want to think about what success means. It might look different to different people, to different delegations, but it may also take different forms. So I always think that it's helpful to think in terms of elements of success and elements of failure in any outcome. Of course, the challenging context was already mentioned that will affect the conference and its outcome. And the lack of consensus in the CWC is not a new issue. So that should not be, the lack of consensus should not be seen necessarily as a problem or as a failure per se. The review conference is part of a wider process of deliberations of different documents that are put forward, and there's value in all of that process. So positive outcomes might look different than consensus. And one of the things that we put forward in the report is the possibility of having certain decisions taken by the conference on particular issues of importance to states parties that can provide guidance for the next 5 years. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Hand back the mic to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Maria. Just on the issue of gendered issues, I think one of the things we've found in other research that we've done at UNIDIR is that chemical weapons attack is going to be pretty awful for those on the receiving end, but it may not be equally awful for men, women, boys and girls. There would be gendered consequences to the use of any chemical weapon. I think that also has implications for the provision of assistance as well, so it's something to keep in mind, as well as the issues of equality in participation and the statistical dynamic as well. So I think there's two aspects to that to think about. With that in mind, I now want to open up the floor to any questions that people may have, or the screen indeed. If people have questions, I'd like to write those in to the Q&A function. Please do let us know. Does anybody wish to take the floor? Raise your hand at all, please. Sir. I think we need to get a microphone to you, so I might go take a slightly more roaming role here.
Yeah, right here. That one.
Yep.
This one.
Thank you. My name is Zikrul Hassan Fahad, and I'm first secretary in the Bangladesh Embassy. And I look after the OPCW issue. So I try to look after the OPCW issue. So my question to Mr. Kelly is that you mentioned about the IIT of making it mainstreaming in the OPCW's missions. But OPCW has a is regular inspection mechanism on the fact-finding mission. So how do you differentiate of IIT becoming why IIT should be mainstreaming in as a fact-finding mission, number one. And number two is to Ms. Maseda. So you talked about or touched upon a lot of issues that the REFCON 5 we might have, but I think geographical diversity is also as important as gender equality, because I think many state parties and regional groups are looking for and trying to see the OPCW to have, equitable geographical distribution, so that all the developing and developed countries can move together for a better future. So I would like to have your comments on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a useful set of questions to kick off with. If I come to you shortly for the second part of the question, but perhaps if I can turn to Alexander to take the first question. Do you want to go first? Okay.
Yep. Thank you very much for the question, and that allows me to sort of elaborate a bit more on my thinking about that. Which I've also put down in writing, just to plug a forthcoming journal article of mine, which should be out hopefully not too later this year in the Non-Proliferation Review, where I try to trace this fundamental change that I see happening over the past 25 years from an organization whose primary mission in relation to CW and the disarmament of or destruction of CW is, from the starting point being the verification of declared stockpiles, to the identification of the perpetrators of use nowadays. So there is a clear shift in sort of the priorities, or what is dominating the discussions and the debates. And what I would argue we have seen in the summer of 2018, as a matter of fact, is that a new obligation, a new normative guideline was established by that conference decision that said it is okay for the organization to go beyond determining whether or not CW use has occurred, which is sort of the FFM type of operation, going out and checking whether the alleged use actually has happened, to determining who might be behind those kinds of attacks once it has been ascertained. So that is going one step further in a sense. And I think that many might understand to have been limited to CW uses in a particular state party only. And my reference to paragraphs 19 and 20 of that conference decision was just to illustrate the point that, yes, in the first instance, that is correct. That was certainly the trigger. But my reading of the intention of the states parties at that particular point in time would be that this is also something that in a medium to longer term perspective should be available for states parties to use. And that's the wording of those paragraphs. The states parties can request the technical secretariat and the director general to support them in making that determination who might be behind a chemical weapons attack on their territory. So the intention, quite clearly in my reading of that conference decision, is that it is not limited only to one particular state party. And that's where I would see the difference, and why I think it might really be useful in clarifying and reconfirming that this is actually the case.
Okay, Alexander. Alex, did you want to follow up on that at all? Okay, in that case, I'll pass over to you on the diversity question. I think this is something you professionally have an interest in. So, Mr. Flores.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that. I completely agree with what you just said about the importance of diversity in general, included geographical diversity. This is something that we actually highlight a couple of times in the report, so it's there for sure. There are different aspects that we can mention in that regard. Of course, we have the rotation of the groups for office holders. That is one. And in that regard, also the importance of effective coordination within the groups must be highlighted. Another aspect is what I already mentioned about the importance of hearing all voices in all of the preparatory process of the review conference, and making sure that the processes are inclusive and and really open to all for participation. Again, kind of avoided that in-group, out-group dynamics as much as possible. And thirdly, perhaps mentioning again that this could also be linked to international cooperation and assistance activities as well. So the geographical diversity also important in those aspects, of course, and capacity building and strengthening capacities all around the world, of course, but also how we make sure that these efforts are sustained in time and the countries have ownership of this international cooperation and assistance programs, and that they are sustained within each country as well. So I think efforts in that regard have been made by the Technical Secretariat and the States Parties to ensure that those things get better over time. So yeah, there's a diversity of aspects in which this particular thing is really important. But absolutely, I agree. And I think we all agree in the panel.
I just wanted to add on, because I think both very good questions, but just on the sort of latter question, I don't see these things as competing. Actually, I see gender equality and geographic representation as two sides of the same coin. And by increasing access and gender equality, actually, you increase, I mean, if you take, for instance, a state party, if you have gender equality in it, then 100% of your population get an opportunity to work with the OPCW, as opposed to, say, 50%. So I think that seeing these two concepts not as competing, but as things that can support each other moving forward, I think might be a constructive way forward. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I can see Ian Anthony, Dr. Ian Anthony, wants to take the floor. I'll bring you a microphone.
Yes, thank you. One of the significant achievements since the last review conference has been the completion of the Chemtech Center. And a lot of people deserve congratulations for bringing that ship into the harbor successfully. But in order for the center to fulfill its maximum potential, I think it really needs a multi-year program of work, which is put on a secure financial basis, and which can serve the broadest possible community of CWC participating states. So given what you've said about elements of success, if the review conference focused on producing that program of work over the duration of time to the next review conference, and an agreement on how that was going to be put on a secure financial footing, the conference is already a success, whatever else happens. So I hope that can be one of the elements of success, because it's a new resource, and I haven't heard anybody say that it's a negative development. It's something everybody can get behind. So I think that's something that deserves a lot of attention at the review conference.
Thanks. I suspect the panel will probably agree, but I'll open it to them if anybody wants to take the floor.
Yeah. I think, well, I guess we all agree as we sit up here, it's an obvious, it has the potential to be an obvious success story. What I find remarkable, which is sort of the flip side of what you've just said, is that this was able to be done on the basis of voluntary contributions only. I think that is an important, a remarkable part of the success story so far. However, for everybody, for all states parties to feel a strong sense of ownership, not only would I argue that the program needs to address as many of the diverse interests that states parties bring to the table, it should also be funded from the general budget of the organization. I think trying to continue to do this on the basis of voluntary contributions over time will lead to less than ideal outcomes and might open the center up to unwarranted criticisms. As we all know, sometimes funding can determine the trajectory of particular kinds of activities and which direction they develop. So if you just rely on sponsoring and voluntary contributions from individual states parties or groups of states parties, that might be a future criticism leveled against that new center. And in order to avoid that from the very beginning, I think that is one of the main reasons why I would argue not only does it need a strategic plan of work, again, fully agreeing with the comment from the floor, but also the funding should be transferred from voluntary contributions to the more stable regular budget of the organization. Thank you for raising the issue.
Thanks, Alexander. Does anybody else wish to raise any questions, comments from the floor in person? Yes, please. We could, again, bring your microphone.
Thank you, Alex Mikulski from the United States delegation. Thank you to the UK for supporting this and for the expert panel here for their contributions. I have a question about the third possible outcome, which is this idea of kind of discrete decisions on different issues. It seems to me that most of the preparations are aimed at a comprehensive document, whether that comes as an agreed document or a chairman's report. And I'm curious, kind of from a procedural standpoint, who would go about drafting it? What's the process for developing and agreeing it to it, especially if you assume you're going to get pretty close to the review conference before you're kind of in a position to look at some of those contingency options, and kind of what the TS should be doing, what states parties should be doing to actually develop those. We also, just the way the calendar works here at the OPCW, have an executive council meeting not too long after the review conference. So I'd be kind of curious about what your views on are as to whether it should be at the review conference or in the policymaking ordinance themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a good question. Does anybody want to go first on that?
Well, I think it's a good question because we've been sort of, I guess, scratching our heads about that as well, about how this would actually play out. So one potential way in my mind is through the open-ended working group and the kind of more immediate preparatory stuff which is happening at the moment, moving towards getting some draft decisions which, as you say, may not be suitable or possible to sort of follow through in the review conference setting. That might be possible to bring up at CSP in November. And I know that sounds a bit sort of, well, it's the review conference and we should be doing it then. But if we're trying to think outside the box a little bit here, and not be entirely conditioned by what's happened in the past, that might be one potential avenue to explore. I'm just throwing the cat amongst the pigeons. I don't know if people might disagree with that, but I think it's, you know, given how difficult this is and the limited time as well that we've got during the review conference to actually talk about these things, you don't want to add in, I guess, new dimensions of debate by introducing decisions. Perhaps it is about using this process to be able to come for an actual decision at CSP in November.
I think the question is a good one, and it's a really tricky one because raising that issue for us also represented a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, as we say in the report, our ideal world scenario would be a substantive document providing strategic guidance adopted by consensus. Okay, so that's the ideal case. But if we, for whichever reason, expect that ideal case not to materialize, the question becomes, what are the alternatives? And can these alternatives be pursued in a way that it doesn't reduce the likelihood of the ideal case perhaps happening still? So on the one hand, you don't want to start too late to identify and work on these separate decisions on clearly delineated issues or issue areas, so as not to sabotage the work that is ongoing and that I think should be ongoing up until And for me, it's easy to say that because I don't have to do it. I mean, you will have to make this work at the review conference, but to really maintain the momentum towards a, as I just said, substantive, consensual, strategically oriented outcome document. On the other hand, if you leave it too late, and that's where sort of the other edge of the sword comes in. If you leave it too late, you may not have enough time left in the context of a 5-day review conference to actually identify the issues. Well, there may be, well, identification may be the most easy part of it, but then to draw the various bits of text together that you would have to draw together because of the 3-part structure, at least of the first OEWG chairperson's report. I mean, any decision you would want to have, I assume, some backward-looking element to it, recognizing the importance of the issue you're about to make a decision, outlining at least very briefly the accomplishments that have been achieved or the deficiencies, the gaps that you would like to address, and then actually have the actionable items as part of the decision. And at the moment, these are spread across at least 2 of the 3 sections of the document. So you would have to identify which issues you think may be ripe for a separate decision, and then draw these text elements together, and then actually do the legwork to make sure that this would be agreeable to everybody in the room as a separate decision, and agreeing that the conference has a consensus. I mean, there are all sorts of wording that one could think about then, recognizing that there is a consensus about a particular issue or whatever. I mean, there are precedents also in other treaty regimes where at review, and one case I'm thinking about the Review and Extension Conference of the NPT in 1995, creative wording was used and was applied. So that doesn't really answer your question in a clear-cut way of who should start when doing exactly what. But I think these are the issues that one needs to keep in mind when thinking about a plan B. And if you have serious doubts about plan A panning out as you'd like to see it, at one point in time, I think everybody should start working or thinking constructively about a plan B. And that may be the recognition that the outcome from RC4 wasn't so bad after all, and leave it at that. But we felt as a team of authors that actually may not be that advisable, given that then the next opportunity for the Conference of States Parties meeting as a review conference to provide strategic guidance would only be in 2028, which would be 15 years after RC3, which would have then still been the last review conference with a consensual outcome document. So if any decisions can be taken by consensus, I think that would improve on a pure chairperson's report.
Thank you, Alexander. Maria, did you want to? Sorry, Alec, you want to come back on this one?
No.
I was just going to also say that in outcome 3, there's the discussion about having specific decisions, and I know that is a problem, but I guess or a difficulty or challenge. Something else we were thinking about was, so a watered down idea of a decision might well be a statement on behalf of 180 states parties, or 190, or whatever, as many state parties as possible on very specific issues which can galvanize broad consensus. Having those simply as a statement put to the conference, and then in whatever outcome report is generated, there could be some language around the idea of, the conference noted, or some other sort of supportive language noted the statement by 185 state parties on the future of ICA, or what have you. But, so there are different ways of trying to build a concept or an idea of consensus, which isn't necessarily the traditional idea of just having a nice big outcome document. That's what I think in my mind anyway, of trying to think a bit more broadly about how we can get people sort of having some optimism in this moving forward. Thanks.
Always welcome. Optimism is. Thank you, Alex. Maria, did you want to follow up on this one?
Not really. I think everything was just said. The element of creative thinking and trying to think outside the box of things that have played out in the past is key in this third outcome in the report. Another aspect is that you might be able to do this as a parallel process as well, without necessarily undermining the ultimate goal of a consensus document, but already having some elements in place for other plans, Plan B, Plan C. Again, all this is possible only with sufficient planning and sufficient discussion ahead of time.
Thank you, Maria. I've got a couple of questions coming in online at the moment, but did anybody else wish to take the floor from in the room, from the in-person audience here? If not, we have one question on lessons learned from the BWC Review Conference and the MPT Review Conference last year. And there's a second question, well, several questions actually, which have come in around poisoning of schoolgirls in Iran. Just on the latter point, I think, if I may, from our side, we're obviously aware of this, and we've had several reports referring to schoolgirls in Iran reportedly being treated for poisoning in what is again, reported as a toxic gas attack. Some have suggested there have been up to 1,000 students that have been affected since November and suffered from respiratory problems, nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. We understand this is being investigated, but I should point out at the moment that there's a lot of speculation around what's happening and who might be responsible. For those of us on the panel, it's extremely difficult really to be able to draw any firm conclusions as to what is happening based on the information we have available to us at this stage. What I think we can say, and I think I can speak for all the panel here when I say we condemn that the use of chemical weapons at any time by any person, and that those responsible for the use of chemical weapons need to be held to account for their actions. But really beyond that, I'm not sure there's a great deal else we can say, but I'll offer it to panelists if you do wish to take the floor. No. Okay, obviously we'll continue to follow this, and yeah, so well, there seems to be several questions coming in, but I'm not sure we have a great deal else that we can say on this. So perhaps I could turn to the question on lessons from past review conferences in the BWC and the MPT. Maria, you were present for most of the BWC review conference. Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so a couple of things pop up in my mind on this topic in particular. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but what I said before is also informed by that process in the BWC last year. So essentially, one of the lessons learned or good things that we've seen in the BWC Review Conference in November, December, was that there was a good preparation process, even with the busy calendar that diplomats had last year. The chairpersons, the implementation support unit, they came together, they were well prepared for the conference. So that's definitely one point that I can think as a lesson learned in that regard. Another point that comes to mind now is, again, how do you define success, right? And in the BWC, the outcome was different and sort of what people expected in two ways, essentially. First, it was not the ideal outcome document that people wished for at the beginning, but it was something. It was an outcome, even though it was not complete, if you want to put it that way. So again, that idea of having elements of success and elements of failure to assess any given outcome of a review conference kind of is tied to that as well. Yeah, I think those are the two things that I can think of right now. I'm sure you have also other thoughts.
Yes, but perhaps I can turn to colleagues on my right. First of all, if there anything you want to raise.
Well, I have to admit, I have not followed it in as much detail, certainly not as much detail as Maria has. So having a bit more of a distant view, perhaps I can say that I was positively surprised by the outcome because expectations were fairly low going into the review conference on the back of the not so splendid outcome of the NPT RevCon. And so in that sense, yes, definitions of success matter and they are different in different contexts. But I think the important bits were achieved. The important elements were in there. The ISU has a basis for continuing working. There is a working group format now that has been agreed that will keep discussion on the most salient issues alive. And that is important and relevant in the BWC context. And so what we can perhaps learn from that is that in a less than ideal outcome scenario for the CWC review conference, what are the really important issues that you think you would like to see a consensus on, a decision on, what have you, whatever form of agreement and provision of guidance for the work of the organization and the secretariat can be provided. So what I would take away from that BWC RevCon experience is that the important elements in that context were realized. And for me, that leads me to ask, what are the important elements and the important outcomes that one really should focus on in the CWC context and get clarity about those.
Thank you, Alexander. Did you want to follow up?
Nothing groundbreaking compared to what everyone else has said, but I think just to reflect on the fact that the BWC is slightly different insofar as we have an OPCW with 500 odd people working, doing day-to-day activities. So I think we should be recognizing in the CWC RevCon sort of context that there are a range of issues. There's some which are highly contentious, but there's also the sort of day-to-day stuff that's sort of thinking what we're doing in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Agreement might not be total. We might not get that total success that we want. But as we've said in the report, hopefully there are some issue safe spaces and we can kind of hone in on some of those and try and get those through the review conference and lay foundations of things to work on sort of in that next intersessional period.
Thanks, Alex. And a couple of things from my side that I think were important in terms of ingredients. There was a series of regional workshops organised by the Implementation Support Unit, which took place in the months before the review conference. There was a high-level Montreux retreat event, which I think brought together about 80, 90 diplomats, representatives of states parties. And I think that allowed some ideas to be further socialized and discussed and begin to kind of inform what a vision of success might look like across different diplomatic groups. Those things are quite useful. It's probably worth keeping in mind some of the other challenges. So we had COVID delays. We also had delay with getting a president for the review conference. And then there was real considerable geostrategic tension, including allegations around biological weapons development, which made this really quite a challenging review conference to have. And I think in that regard, it is a modest success in extremely difficult times. And I really do think it does provide a sort of a vision or a sort of a glimmer of hope as to what can be done despite difficult circumstances. I'll stop there, but any other questions, comments from the audience at all? Anybody else want to raise? Yeah, please. I'm not sure whether the microphone's wanted. Yeah, I'll bring it up.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Verijn. I'm the Deputy Perm Rep of the Netherlands. I'm sorry for my ambassador being here today, but he has fallen ill over the weekend. As you know, he is the chair designate of the review conference. On his behalf, maybe I can make a few remarks. First of all, he is organizing a retreat, as was mentioned by Ms. Carson. You should already have received a save the date, and the official invitation will come shortly. Second, he will be doing outreach here in The Hague to regional groups and in Brussels. And of course, he will also be available for individual delegations who would like to talk to him. And he will also be reaching out to individual delegations if he feels that would help the process. So that's it from what I can say on behalf of my ambassador. Maybe a question putting on my national hat. So not speaking for my ambassador, just to be clear. The issue of the NGO participation. Is there anything you can say about that? I would be very interested to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the update. And there's a question there on NGO participation. Does anybody want to kick off? That is something that we mentioned in the report. Please. There is a question in the back. I think my colleague's going to bring you a microphone, I think, but do you want to answer the NGO question? Well, yeah. Please, Alex.
Well, with the NGO participation, I know that historically there's been problems deriving often from a lack of transparency from the general committee. So NGOs not knowing what the process is looking like, and then not really being clear as to why there are delays, who's responsible for delays, and when they find out there's not enough time, there's not enough funding. These are long-held problems. Recently, I think over the last 9 months, the technical secretariat has certainly reached out to the Chemical Weapons Coalition, and this sort of umbrella group of NGOs. I think we've instigated quite a healthy kind of dialogue there moving forward. But I think for NGOs, it's about transparency from states parties as to timeline. I think the other issue is more general funding and sort of supporting NGOs, not just to come to meetings, but actually to support the kind of research and sort of activity within the work of the OPCW during the intersessional periods, supporting implementation where possible, outreach, engagement, sort of things. But looking specifically at the review conference, I think we're in a better sort of mood and position than we have been over the last sort of 5 years. That I think dialogue with the TS has been much better than it has been in the past. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I think it's very hard as an NGO to talk about the NGO situation because we have to be careful what we say, and we don't really have a picture of the whole room.
Well, this has not been scripted, by the way, but it may turn out to be some kind of good cop, bad cop type of answer. If that was sort of what Alex just said was the good cop answer, perhaps I can add a bit more of a critical perspective. Having worked on CWC issues since 1994, having participated in all previous review conferences and most of the regular CSPs, I think there are two issues that deserve mentioning. One is the access to information. You have to realize, and I think some state party representatives are not realizing this, that NGOs can only be as helpful to your work to the extent that we receive up-to-date information about what is going on. And that is at times coming out only with a significant delay, that information in the form of official series documents, or it's not coming at all. So we know that since last June, the open-ended working group has met on several occasions. We know that there has been a first draft of the open-ended working group chairperson circulated. To the best of my knowledge, there was no effort made to create transparency vis-a-vis the interested community of NGOs and think tanks as to national papers, for example, that were submitted. So I realize a lot of that depends on the procedures and mechanisms by which the organization operates. But my view from the outside, trying to look in, is that unless a states party explicitly says, I would like this to be posted not only on the internal server, but also on the public-facing webpage, we as NGOs do not, could you pass me that document? We are very unlikely to get timely access to relevant information. And again, only on the basis of such information can we provide quality inputs into the processes you are stuck in, day out. And I think that that linkage is often not really appreciated. And I'm not sure what to do about it, but that's one of the things that I've been dealing with repeatedly over more than 2 decades. The other issue is the at times arbitrary refusal, or so one hears. Again, these are not public meetings and no records are circulated. But from what one hears, the arbitrary refusal of certain NGOs by certain states parties. And again, that is where this issue of transparency comes in a massive way. And I warned you, my remarks wouldn't be as positive as Alex Gionis's one. But if you'd like to help NGOs support your work, then those are 2 issues that you might want to consider tackling one way or another. And again, on the basis of hearsay, I have picked up that there is a paper that has been circulated in the context of the open-ended working group to prepare the review conference that tries to address some of the NGO access issues. But again, that paper hasn't been made public, so we cannot really comment or try to provide useful additional thoughts.
Thank you for the Bangkok tape, Alexander. Did you want to come in this?
No, not really. I'm not part of an NGO. But from an UNIDIR's perspective, and also it's what we wrote in this report, just the importance of the collaboration or the inputs that not only NGOs but civil society in general can provide to states parties should always be kept in mind. Nothing else.
I'm conscious of time, so the gentleman back, please. The floor
Yeah,
is,
thank you. My name is Ziad Al-Atiyah, the permanent representative of Saudi Arabia. First of all, I'd like to thank UNIDIR and the UK representation for organizing this report launch. I'd like to start it with Mr. Alexander Kelly when he said outsiders. Outsiders actually the ones who can generate ideas. Why in the report actually doesn't adopt a problem-solving based approach? I mean, for the problems that claim to be associated with the operation of the CWC. Let me just mention, it's very technical issues. I mean, like the tenure policy. How can we solve it if we don't have, for example, a consensus in changing the status quo? How can we link it to the chemical center as a station of breeding, if I may say, new staff to the organization, namely inspectors, for example. We have an issue of lack of inspectors. The other issue is the international cooperation. How can we link it to national implementation in terms of capacity building and using the center to strengthen the state's capacity, especially the developing states, to maintain their national implementation. Thank you.
thank you. I think you raised a really good point on international cooperation, capacity building related issues as well, particularly. So thank you. Does anybody wish to kick off on that?
Well, I think you mentioned we're talking about tenure in there as well, which is, I think, quite an interesting personal area in all of this. And I think, yeah, it's very difficult about consensus. I mean, it's been recognized that the current formulation of the tenure policy has implications for obtaining, training, retaining staff. It's got cost implications, it's got knowledge management implications, institutional memory. There's a whole gamut of challenges that come with any formulation of a tenure policy. And I think one way forward is framing of this debate, because nowhere in the Chemical Weapons Convention does it actually stipulate a tenure policy. It doesn't say that it's a non-career organization. It doesn't say that there's a 7-year tenure policy. So my approach to this would be to think, well, to look and see what it does say. And it talks about having, you know, the condition of service to be the necessity of securing the highest standards of efficiency, competence, and integrity. So I think a way forward for states parties is to say, well, is the current formulation of the tenure policy allowing us to achieve what the convention is telling us to have in light of these changing circumstances? So retaining knowledge, new challenges emerging in the ChemTech Centre. So sort of going back to the convention and saying, do we need to rethink what the tenure policy looks like, what the formulation is, so we can achieve a sort of service of people able to achieve these new goals? Because I think the formulation which exists at the minute was designed as a political sort of process with a different OPCW in mind. This was an OPCW in 1997, 1998, which came up with this. So I think it's a good time to start the process of discussing and reviewing and reflecting on where we go with this. I don't think consensus is going to happen overnight, and it needs this kind of dialogue. The TS involved all states parties, but certainly over the next 5 years, you know, I think this is the time to start reflecting on it and open this debate up. So yeah, good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Maria, did you want to comment on the preparation?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I think that to your first comment, it's also not up to us to provide all of the solutions to the problems. It's up to states parties to discuss and find the best solutions as well. We can provide certain ideas or input, but we don't have the answers to everything. On international cooperation and the linkages on national implementation, I think that's a very good point. And actually, this, in fact, you can discuss these issues as discrete, different articles or different issues, but in practice, they are linked to each other effectively. And this also kind of ties up to that practice of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. I'll leave it there. But yeah, so international cooperation and assistance can be linked to different articles in the convention. Effectively, you have Article 6 and 7 on national implementation, then 10 on provision of assistance, and then 11 on cooperation or economic and technical development, right? In fact, they're all connected, and capacity building, international cooperation and assistance takes place across all of these articles. There are, of course, some grievances, some issues that have been there throughout the years, and not to hide those away or not to recognize them. But I think that also this is an area in which the organization has done tremendous work. This is part of what also Alex was saying in terms of all of the things that the technical secretariat is the bulk of the work of the OPCW, which is the non-contentious, let's say, or the routine aspects that do work well. And it's one of the aspects that to look forward to, right? And all of the things that can be done because of the OPCW. So yeah, that would be my comment on that particular aspect. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything.
Somebody wants to play back cop again?
No, not really. Doing that once while being on a panel, that's perfectly enough for me. I would just like to make the point that I fully agree with the ambassador. Yes, this report has not been written as a piece to offer solutions to problems that we in a first step then would have had to identify. But that simply was not the brief we were given. So if you look at sort of the overall composition of the document, these key issues are, I think it's section 8. So fairly late in the document, it is one of several other issues we were asked to cover. And I think that sort of brief we were given and then how we sort of tried to tick as many boxes of the brief we had has led inevitably and also to the word limit we had to work with as with any publication, you are working within certain parameters. That's all of that combined just didn't lend itself to structure the report in a way that it would have been more useful from a problem-solving approach. But this being said, there is still time between now and the review conference, and while we have our work schedule that we're looking at for the rest of the year, all of us, I'm sure we can squeeze in some time to stay in touch, to continue the discussion, and to further the collaboration on these kind of questions if there is interest in the room.
Thank you, Alexander. I mean, I'd echo that as well. I'm not sure UNIDIR is the organization that should be doing the drafting of solutions that could be potentially problematic and unwelcome in many cases. But I certainly take your point. I'm looking through my screen and the floor now. I wanted to ask, did anybody else wish to raise any other questions, comments? Sit at the back, sir, please, if you could. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really enriching discussions. I work within the technical secretariat, but it's just a personal question. You mentioned something very important in the context, that is the advancements in science and technology. And do you foresee any recommendation for the next review conference on this matter?
Okay, so very good questions. Anybody want to kick off? Alex?
Well, I'm not sure, is the SAB report so I guess that will contain the sort of key recommendations. I'm not sure if we would task necessarily with assessing or looking at the sort of evolution of it, but what I would do is talk about S&T in a contextual way and sort of say that whatever the SAB is looking at and putting forward and helping states parties to think about, to influence or help them to sort of position their own thoughts. The inspectors, the TS generally, the OPCW generally has to operate within this environment of technological change anyway, which is in some cases close to issues of chemical weapons, but more broadly technological change, which might have nothing to do with chemical weapons. So, I mean, if I was to speak beyond what we've just written here, advances in artificial intelligence, I think these are areas which will be incredibly important for obviously society at large and most of the industries and areas of human activity, but also what the OPCW is or can do. So in terms of its internal processes and the technology it uses for verification, this will require state parties, I think, to consider artificial intelligence and because set up a process in which they might wish to consider how to integrate new technologies into existing tasks. So I'm saying that in a very long-winded way, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the technical secretariat cannot just integrate new technologies. There's a huge discussion, political discussion often that has to come with that. So I think any discussions about AI might take a few years at least to move forward.
Thanks, actually, if I could just follow up on that, having gone through the report, I think it usefully goes into things like AI, as my colleague was talking about, but also additive manufacturing, uncrewed systems, drug delivery methods, and things like encapsulation. There's quite a wide range of topics which are converging and moving forward with chemistry, which I think present a range of risks for consideration by states parties. Well, what's also encouraging in the report, and perhaps consistent with the obligatory UNIDIR optimism on my side, is that it actually points to opportunities as well. Opportunities in terms of looking at emerging imaging technologies for verification purposes, next generation analytical techniques, and looking at how you could use, for example, hyperspectral satellite surveillance to actually improve the existing verification regime that we have at the moment. So looking at both those risks, but also importantly, sometimes I think we forget the vast opportunities that are presented by advances in technology. I've realized I should perhaps ask my colleagues on the panel who should be speaking about these things. So Alexander, please.
No, just to add perhaps a more practical element to our collective answer from the panel up here. What I usually find quite instructive on the back end of this SAB report, the Director General issues a document which I see as sort of the first effort to make sense of what that SAB document. It can be a session report from one of the regular sessions of the SAB, or in this particular case, the SAB report to the review conference. And if US state party representatives take that sort of as a first set of translation of the SAB more technical documents, then I think that probably would make it easier to identify the areas you would want to focus on, and where you in the various areas that my colleagues have already mentioned find it particularly useful to have the review conference make a statement, include a paragraph in the final outcome document, or whatever the case may be. So yes, the SAB report quite obviously is important, but then that is a very long and very detailed and at times very technical document. So from a policy practitioner perspective, the DG paper on the SAB report may actually be more useful in trying to translate what the SAB sees as necessary to do, to translate that into something that is actually actionable at the end.
Anybody else wish to take any further questions or comments? I'm also conscious there are other events going on, so please feel if you need to leave, please don't feel. Please do go as you see fit. I can't see any other questions. Just looking online, I think there's perhaps a couple of questions around issues related to the scope of the convention. I don't know whether everybody wants to take that, and the question of the general purpose criteria perhaps as well. We've seen developments over the past couple of years in terms of the scope and the changing of the schedules. Anybody want to take on that particular point on scope? Falling back to you again, Alexander, you've written on this topic, so it's easier for you to start.
Yes, just to state the obvious, I hope it is the obvious that I'm stating. The schedules do not define the scope of the convention. The schedules are a verification tool. The scope of the convention is contained in the first couple of articles. The scope is comprehensive, and the general purpose criterion is trying to give an expression to this comprehensive scope of the convention. I don't have the wording at the top of my head here, but if you look at Article 2, Paragraph 1, talking about toxic chemicals in types and quantities that have no justification, then you're on the right track, because the prohibition in the Chemical Weapons Convention is truly comprehensive, and then it only starts backpedaling from that comprehensive prohibition in places like Article 6, which talks about activities not prohibited, but any use of a toxic chemical to harm, permanently incapacitate, or to kill a human or an animal is a use of a chemical weapon. So in that sense, I think thank you to the person online raising this question and giving me the opportunity to make that clear. Sometimes in media reporting, you can see these somewhat misguided view that the Chemical Weapons Convention schedules define what is a chemical weapon. They do not. They just help the technical secretariat in doing its job. And I'm happy to repeat that time and again, so that it's equally well understood everywhere.
I think as well, the general purpose criterion helps us to think perhaps usefully as well about the division of labor between who is supposed to be actually implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention, and of course the technical secretariat and the OPCW more broadly is the kind of international implementer, but it's quite clear that state parties have a role in national implementation, so directing the convention into their own national legislation, and the comprehensiveness of the treaty of the Chemical Weapons Convention relies on state parties fulfilling their obligations through effective national implementation. So, you know, I think when we talk about the scope of the convention, you know, the technical secretariat is doing its routine activities, but we also need to be aware of what state parties actually should be doing domestically to implement the convention.
I can't see any other questions. Given the time, I'd suggest perhaps if I offer the floor to each of the panelists. Perhaps I can offer the floor to each of our panelists to provide some closing remarks. And if there's nothing else you wish to add, I suggest perhaps you take the question of what one thing would you suggest that diplomats need to do, or what one step would you like to see coming from this? If you were to be presented with a chemical weapons convention related genie, what one wish would you put to that genie? And perhaps starting with you, Alex, unless there's any other questions. Perhaps start with.
I think for me, I think the next 5 years we need to be thinking about national implementation again. So I'm sorry, it sounds boring, but we've been going back to that. And I think aside from the pressing issues around Syria and the use of chemical weapons, there's a broader need to bring state parties who have traditionally not been close to the kind of security component, the sort of destruction element, into this narrative. And I think that is about expanding the narrative of what the Chemical Weapons Convention is about. And that's about connecting, potentially, thinking more creatively about the CWC, not as a sort of isolated disarmament treaty, but one which can connect and support other ones in environmental areas or the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, yes, is that correct? Too many acronyms. But I think it's about connecting these things out over the next 5-10 years, starting to develop the place of the CWC in the minds of more states parties, not just the traditional ones. I think that's
okay. Thanks, Alex. Perhaps I can turn to you.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm also going to sound again like a broken record. There is one thing I would like to emphasize once again is preparations, both within states and across states. That for me is a key element in whatever outcome you're going to be able to achieve in 5 days. Again, the outcome will depend on the preparations before those 5 days, obviously. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to add anything else. Just again, think about the issues that, as it was said, are really important for the convention in the next 5 years, how you can bring those in the conference and achieve results on that. And finally, one hope is that this report is not offering ready-made solutions to states parties, but I do hope it helps new delegates or smaller delegations in the preparations, because having been on the other side, I know how important that is. That's it. Thank you.
Alexander.
Thank you for that question about letting the genie out of the bottle. So if I could have one wish, it would be that states parties find a way to coalesce around a new vision for the organization. In a way, the first 25 years or 26 years now, sort of the unifying element was the verified destruction of declared chemical weapon stockpiles. And that business line is going to go away fairly quickly. So what next? And I was hoping that over the past few years, this notion that was promoted by the previous DG and also by the current DG, I think, of preventing the re-emergence of chemical weapons would be catchy enough, flexible enough, so that it attracts as many followers and supporters as possible. I'm not yet sure whether I'm seeing sort of a widespread support for that concept, for that notion. And therefore, it might perhaps be a good idea if I had my way with this genie who could influence your thinking. It might be a good way or a good idea for you all to have another look or to give this concept of preventing the re-emergence, perhaps a new thought, an additional thought, and see what it entails and what it might help you achieve in more concrete terms. And I'll better leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I think it's plenty for our genie to be doing. I think unless there are any further questions from anyone on the floor, I suggest we conclude the panel now. But I do want to say thank you to all of you for joining us here and providing questions. Thank you, Nicola, for joining and providing opening remarks. It's very kind of you. We appreciate it. And thank you to our panelists really for your time in both putting the report together, but also coming and joining us here for this conversation. If people do have further questions, comments, or things moving forward, we're available online and happy to discuss these things further. I'd also like to express my thanks to funders for all our work at UNIDIR, but particularly in this case, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for providing support for this project, the report and the events we're doing. Also, thank you to the production team back in Geneva and UNIDIR who help us put this event together and with the recording and the online section. So particular thanks to Sarah and Shizuka back in Geneva. Yes, and really, once again, thank you all for joining. Really for what I think was a really interesting discussion. We do have some feedback forms, both online. I think if my colleague Sarah is showing those behind us on the screen, there's a QR code. There is also some hard copy feedback forms there if you'd like to fill those in. We do appreciate your feedback. It does help us improve things moving forward and learn lessons from events. So please do let us know, and it doesn't take very long. You'll be relieved to know. But with that, I just remains for me to say thank you all for joining again, and we wish you the best with your preparations for the review conference moving forward. Thank you, folks. All the best.